Good evening. Welcome to the second part of our series entitled Becoming an R12 Christian. Last week, as we looked at verse 1 of chapter 12, we looked at the fact that our response, what should be our response, or our response to this abundant and magnificent grace of God should be offering of our lives as a sacrifice, offering of our heart, mind, spirit, and our flesh as a sacrifice to God, that being our ideal response to the grace of God. Today, we're going to look at verse 2. And in verse 2, Paul talks about how to bring in that paradigm shift, that change in our mindset, so that we are able to live our lives as a sacrifice to God. Don't worry. I'm going to expedite this process from next week onwards. I'm going to take bigger chunks, and for next 2 weeks, I'm going to finish this chapter. But these two verses, verse 1 and 2, have so much theology and application in it that I can't just club them. Okay? So let's read verse 1 and verse 2. Verse 1, it says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Verse 2, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Now, verse 2 has 4 parts to it. Part 1, Paul says, do not be conformed to this world. Part 2, but be transformed by the renewal of mind. Part 3, so that you may approve what is the will of God. And part 4, the will of God is good, pleasing, and perfect. So let's just first look at this verse in isolation. Let's just look at this verse and make some observations. And once we have finished looking at this verse, then we'll merge it with the larger context. All right? So let's just look at part 1. Paul says, do not be conformed to this world. The word conformed is again a command. And the word conformed has a picture attached to it. The word means being molded into or being molded after something. Have you ever baked a cake? When you're actually making the batter of a cake, you see that batter is very fluid. It has no shape. But once you pour that batter into a mold and you bake it, you see the cake takes the shape of that mold, whether it is square, whether it is triangle, heart, or animal shape, whatever it is. It takes the shape of that mold. It is similar for this world. This world has a mold. And Paul is saying, don't get molded or don't fit into that mold of this world. Don't get shaped, don't get formed by the mold of this world. Do not conform, Paul says, to the mold of this world. The second important word in this phrase is the word world. The actual Greek word that is translated as the word world is age. The word age, which is translated as the word world, can be seen as this current world as we see it, but it can also have another meaning. It can also mean the age that is this current age. This age, this particular time in the world history. You see, we have had several ages. The first age was the Edenic age, the perfect age, when God created Adam and Eve. They were perfect, they were holy, they were sinless. Genesis chapter 1, Genesis chapter 2. And then we see in Genesis chapter 3 that man sinned. And there began the age of fall, the age of sin and of Satan. So when Paul refers to the word world, he's referring to the sinful age, the age of sin and the age of Satan. Second part, Paul says, but be transformed by the renewal of mind. The first word worth looking is the word but. It's a small word, but it is a very important word. In English grammar, the word but is a contrastive conjunction. Now, this is a bit of a grammar lesson for you. So what the word but does, it makes you understand, the moment you look at the word but, you know that what the author has said before it, now he is going to just flip and say something totally in the opposite direction. All right, so the first verse, when you look at the verse, word but in this verse, you know that Paul has said something and now he's going to contrast it. The second word worth observing is the word transformed. Now, this is a beautiful word. Now, the Greek word that has been translated as the word transformed is actually the word metamorpho, out of which the English word metamorphosis has been derived. I'm sure some of you know what metamorphosis is. But for those who do not know what metamorphosis is, it is basically the process where the caterpillar is transformed or transfigured into a butterfly. So Paul is commanding that don't be conformed, but be transformed completely and unrecognizably transformed, like a caterpillar into a butterfly. The third word worth observing is the word renewal. The word renewal means to make something new. There's something that is existing, you make it new, you renew it, or you reprogram it, or you recondition it. And the final word in this phrase is the word mind. When Paul uses the word mind in this verse, he's talking about your moral consciousness, your practical reasoning. Okay? We'll tie this all together. Just hang on with me. Part 3, he says, so that you may approve what is the will of God. And the word worth observing there is the word approve or discern. The word approve means to examine. The word discern means to examine. What Paul's saying is reprogram your minds, recondition your minds, renew your minds so that you're able to examine, discern, or approve the will of God. It's like you look at a 500 rupee note or a 1,000 rupee note and you look at it carefully, you examine it and you see for certain marks that actually makes that currency note authentic. So that's how he's saying. He said you examine. By reconditioning your mind, you're able to examine the will of God. And you're able to examine that this is will of God, this is not the will of God. And once you examine it, once you approve it, you apply it in your life. You put it in practice. And the fourth part, Paul says, is this will of God is good, pleasing, and perfect. Paul uses 3 words to describe the will of God. Good, pleasing, and perfect. But to who? To us? No, he's saying this will of God is pleasing, is good and perfect to God. You see, these words are not characterizing the will of God. These 3 words are synonymous to the will of God. So this is how you can translate it. This is how you can actually translate it. It says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may practice what is good, what is perfect, and pleasing to God. In essence, His will. So let's tie it together. What Paul is saying in verse 2 is that as believers in whom the Spirit of God resides, you should not mold yourself after the sinful age, but you need to be completely and unrecognizably transform yourself by reconditioning and by reprogramming your thinking. The way you look at things, the way you perceive things, and the way you process things. And the reason you should do this, the purpose behind it, is so that you're able to examine the will of God, know the will of God, and apply the will of God to your life, which is good, which is pleasing to God, and which is perfect. So in the context, when you look at it in the larger context of verse 1, where Paul is saying, offer your lives and yourselves as a sacrifice It is only possible for you to offer yourself as a sacrifice once you have reconditioned your mind to examine, approve, and understand the will of God. Only once you understand the will of God, you will be able to put it into practice. Let's look at the flip side of it. Let's look at the flip side of it. If you have not transformed yourself, if you have not transformed your mind or reprogrammed your mind or reconditioned your mind, you will still operate out of the same old operating system of this world. And if you're operating out of the same old operating system, the thought of sacrificing your life to God, it's like a virus. It's like something alien to that operating system. Because in the wisdom of this age, in the wisdom of sin, you can't really offer your lives as a sacrifice to God. That's worthless. That's futile. Do you get it? Do you get this? If you want to live your lives as a sacrifice for God daily, holy, which is pleasing to God, you need to recondition your mind. You need to completely change the way you think and perceive things. When you see a butterfly, you can't imagine a caterpillar out of it. That kind of a change. Only when this change happens, you can clearly agree, examine, and discern God's will and put it into practice, which means sacrificing your will to God's will. And on daily basis, you'll be able to do God's will. And when you do that, when every time you choose to do God's will over your will, you are living a life of sacrifice. There's much more to say, but I want you to take this and apply it to your lives, where you are today. And may God give you the strength and the zeal to constantly align yourself with God's will for your lives. God bless.